Thank you, Marcus, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers of the conference, especially Sharon Livney, who, when she invited me to participate, asked if I could talk about the art objects in German Jewish homes and what one could say about it. And that led me to my topic today. I'm not going to talk about a particularly typical home, but I think some of the issues that it raises are themes that we've already heard, and I think will come up again during the day. Just referring to what Guy just said, identities, objects, memories, the nexus between those three things, I think, come out very strongly in this particular case study. Anyway, this is I'm going to talk about the various homes that were occupied by this couple, Felicie and Karl Bernstein. They were Russian-born Jews who settled in Berlin, and their home was a significant gathering place in Berlin, beginning in the 1870s, providing welcome to a diverse group of artists, writers, scholars, and museum professionals. The couple's weekly salon was a meeting place for Jews and non-Jews, and it attracted Germans from all over Germany, but also many Berliners, as well as foreigners from France, Scandinavia, and Russia, whether they were residing in Berlin or only temporarily visiting the city. For many of these guests, spending time in the Bernstein home and encountering their art collection was a catalyst for the development of new tastes, perspectives, and developments in German culture at the Jahrhundertwende. And a lot of what also comes up in this, again, to Galili's point earlier, it's a bigger topic about provenance, but that is a kind of, in a way, epitomizes these questions about mobility and dynamics of history. So I'm showing you a book, Karl and Felicie Bernstein, Erinnerungen ihrer Freunde, which was privately published in Dresden in 1914, with contributions by their friends, many of the people who were in their home. This book, without which I think we would not have ever heard of this couple, frankly, or it would be incredibly obscure. It's really the major source, along with other contemporary sources like letters and diaries from people who were either their friends or who visited their home, have left behind rare testimonies that convey not only what the spaces in the Bernstein home looked like, but more importantly, how it felt to inhabit these spaces and how this specific domestic space affected the people who spent time there. This is Georg Treu, who organized the publication of the Erinnerungen. He was a classical archaeologist and curator of the sculpture collection in Dresden, and he had first met Karl Bernstein during their student days, and he remained a devoted friend of the couple over their lifetimes. When Felicie died in 1908, Karl died much earlier in 1894. It was only 52. When she died in 1908, after years of widowhood, it was Treu who served as the co-executor of her estate. And interestingly enough, before he dispersed her belongings and vacated her apartment, he arranged for a photographer to document several rooms in her home, along with some individual works of art, mainly the French Impressionist paintings in her collection. And those were important, they were unusual, they were the first collectors of French Impressionism in all of Germany. But he included all of this in the book. What we learn from this is that he clearly believed that these artworks with which the Bernsteins had surrounded themselves and the way they had arranged and furnished their domestic environment conveyed something essential about his friends' characters and was central to their legacy. So this book has individual reminiscences by friends and visitors to their salon, and then documentation of individual works of art, as well as these domestic interiors. So here I'm showing you the couple, Karl in a portrait by Max Liebermann, the well-known German Jewish Impressionist painter. We'll hear more about him in a minute. And Felicie in what was her bridal photograph. Again, we only have this photograph from the book that Treu edited. Karl Bernstein was born in Odessa in 1842 and came to Berlin to study in the mid-1850s. Having completed his doctoral examinations in Halle, he moved to St. Petersburg, hoping to make a career as a legal scholar. but the anti-Semitic policies of the education minister, Dmitry Tolstoy, prevented his advancement. However, in St. Petersburg, he met Felicie Rosenthal, whom he married in Vienna at the synagogue in 1872, and they then traveled throughout Europe for almost 2 years, eventually settling in Berlin in 1873. And eventually, after many years of struggle, actually, Karl became an außerordentlicher professor of Roman law, only actually, after many years. Felicie was born in 1849 in St. Petersburg, but she also had connections to Germany. She was raised in Dresden after the death of her mother. And rounding out the household, the couple remained childless, but they lived in Berlin with Karl's stepmother, Amelia, whom you see here, and his half-sister, Therese. So his mother died shortly after he was born, and he was basically raised by his stepmother. And actually, Amelia Bernstein is a very important character in our story because her sister had married into the Parisian branch of the Ephrussi family, and her son, Charles Ephrussi, was very important in the Parisian art world, an editor of the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, a friend of the Impressionists, and an early collector of Impressionism. So that was the connection. And also, this extended family was very close, and they were often together. They spent time together in France, and this provided opportunities for the very Francophile Bernsteins to collect French art and furniture and generally partake of French culture, which is something that very clearly marked their home during those years. And in the 1870s in Berlin, with the background of the very recent Franco-Prussian War and various other hostilities, this was something that was not so usual. Okay. In 1877, the Bernsteins moved to an apartment in a house in den Selten 23. The decor was decidedly French and unusual for the Berlin of that time, for some of the reasons I just mentioned. In the book of reminiscences, the Erinnerungen, the painter Max Liebermann, a neighbor during those years, described the Bernsteins' home, and I quote, "They lived directly across from my apartment at the time at den Selten 23 on the second floor of the building, which had been designated by its builder as a temporary housing for the president of the Reichstag." Liebermann described, end quote, Liebermann described the heavy exterior architecture, but noted that, quote, "Once one had successfully climbed the 2 excessively high flights of stairs, one was all the more pleasantly surprised upon entering the Bernstein residence. One felt transported not only to a different house, but to a different city, to Paris," end quote. This is obviously an older photograph. We don't have any interior views from their apartment in this location. I'm just showing you a map of this neighborhood of Tiergarten, which could be a whole other talk actually about kind of Tiergarten as home to a certain segment of German Jewish families, but just to show you. So I circled the Bernsteins, and Liebermann was here, and other guests who we'll meet in a minute, particularly Brandes, were also across the street. So. Liebermann continued in describing the interior, quote, "The Bernsteins' home was furnished entirely according to Parisian taste. I believe, in fact, that all their furniture came from Paris, with the Aubusson, the wonderful Gobelins, the marvelous carved wood and gilt armchairs upholstered in the most beautiful fabrics of their period." So as I said, this is not an interior of that house because we don't have that. But we know that the art and furniture was the same in Felicie's apartment that was documented in 1908, because she even writes about that, about having moved when she unpacked all of these things, kind of reconstituting, as a widow, reconstituting the life that she had had with Karl, and she says how these objects, which had been very dearly beloved, took on a whole new meaning in this new environment when she moved into a different apartment with her sister-in-law, with Therese. And here we can see actually on the far wall, it's dominated by one of the Gobelins tapestries that Liebermann mentioned, and here you're seeing a detail from that photograph And I don't know that this is exactly the same one, though there are many, it might actually very well be the one that was theirs, but if it isn't, it's extremely close, but it gives you a sense of the colors. The tapestry can be identified as the offering of the boar's head from the story of Meleager and Atalanta, made after a design by Charles Lebrun, court painter to Louis XIV. The Bernsteins own two from the series based on Ovid's Metamorphosis, and examples of this tapestry series can be found to this day in European royal collections and residences, and indeed the grand scale seems better suited to palaces than to even the most elegant apartment in the Tiergarten. In this detail from the reception room, we can see both in the fan, which is mounted, can you see it above here? And the portrait of Marie Antoinette, which hangs above the fan, and there you can see in the detail what it would look like. Further testimony to the Bernstein's penchant for French art of the so-called Rococo revival, which was well established in France by the 1870s, but would still take a few decades to catch on in Germany. So these are just a few examples of this sort of French environment in this home. And now something about kind of begin with some of the, just a few selections because of the time of some of the response to this environment. So Adolf Furtwängler was a non-Jewish archaeologist, curator, and museum director eventually, and the father of the famous conductor Wilhelm, was introduced to the Bernstein circle by Georg Treu and his wife, and he described his impressions of the couple and their home in a letter to his mother, and this is, as you can see, in 1880, so actually before they acquired the French Impressionists, so just this other environment. Quote, he is not a millionaire, he is not only a millionaire, but also a private lecturer and lawyer, a great lover of books, owner of a rare library with excellent bindings. His room is a veritable museum, yet tastefully arranged for both use and decoration. Everything filled with genuine oriental carpets and silk embroideries, armchairs adorned with genuine old lace on the wall cabinets, silver antique vessels, old enamels, Chinese vases, etc. Apart from the 18th century French furniture in their home, Karl had an impressive collection of rare French illustrated books from the same period, handheld works of art that he spent many hours perusing. And here you can see an example of the exquisite bindings that Furtwängler noted, as well as Karl's Ex Libris, this is for Dominique. After his death, the books were donated to the Kupferstichkabinett in Berlin, and you can still go there today and look at them. In the summer of 1882, the Bernsteins acquired a group of French Impressionist works and installed them in their home. These were notable acquisitions at a time when Impressionism was not fully accepted in France. The works caused a sensation among the Bernsteins' guests, and due to the influence of many in their circle, it would in turn influence the direction of modern art in Germany. And here we have Sabine Lepsius, a painter, who was a friend and a member of their circle, recalled later, quote, in this salon, conversations with far-reaching significance about art or other intellectual domains could take place. Around the year 1880, the first Impressionist pictures to arrive in Berlin appeared on these walls. Passionately admired or ridiculed, but always discussed, they provided the occasion for plans which were then later realized in the founding of the Secession, end quote. The Secession, for those of you who don't know, was an independent artists association established in 1898. So after Karl's death, it was established to exhibit modern German and also, very importantly, international art in Berlin. Max Liebermann was one of the founders, Sabine Lepsius was another founding member, and Felicie Bernstein was a big supporter, both financially and also in buying from their exhibitions. So now just a kind of quick look at some of the people who entered their home to have a sense of its impact. So these are two men who contributed text to the Erinnerungen, describing the importance of the home and of the art collection. Bode was curator of paintings collection in Berlin from 1890, and in 1905 became the general director of what is today the Berlin State Museums, to which Felicie actually left old master paintings in her will. Hugo von Tschudi was a member of the younger generation of German museum directors and curators who had their earliest encounters with Impressionism via the Bernstein's collection. As director of Berlin's Nationalgalerie, and then because of conflict he entered into with Kaiser, he moved to the Neue Pinakothek in Munich. And in both cases, he really was one of Germany's great institutional champions of international modernism. And in both collections today, you can still see many of the most important works were acquired under his watch. Okay, and here are some of the artists who attended. Everything from sort of conservative older generation like Adolf von Menzel, Max Liebermann, who you've already heard many quotes from, who he also started out as a realist, and his encounters with Impressionism radically transformed his art, and he also then became a very important collector of French Impressionism, including ending up with several works that had belonged to the Bernsteins. And then here, this is Max Klinger, who one print on the left, you can see something that he did, which was kind of a imagining a salon, a Jewish salon in Berlin in the around the turn of the previous century, around 1800. He had written to his parents about the experience of the Jewish salon and this kind of continuity. And then again, of like the ultimate domestic experience of the dog, which was very important in the house. And he made an etching of the terrier, probably held up by the hands of Carl's sister. Okay, so now just a quick look at actually some of these works of art. This is the music room. You can see in Felicie's home. This is where the paintings were hung, and I'll show you individual what these works look like today in a moment. I just want to say, though, that this collection was also important because it provided the occasion for some of the earliest commentaries and writings on Impressionism in Europe. Jules Laforgue, you see on the right, the Franco-Uruguayan symbolist poet, came to Berlin in 1881 to serve as the French reader to the Empress Augusta in the Prussian court. He had been introduced to the Bernsteins by Carl's cousin Charles Ephrussi, who was very important for the connection to Impressionism. And he wrote back to Ephrussi that the Bernsteins are, quote, the most artistic people here, end quote. And when their collection was publicly exhibited in 1883, Laforgue wrote a very important treatise on this physiological and aesthetic explanations of Impressionism, which has really become a canonical text. And if you study like Intro to Art History, you'll have to read that text as in your segment on Impressionism. And then on the other side, you see Georg Brandes, who was also a neighbor in Denselten, Danish writer and critic who lived in Berlin between 1877 and 1883. He wrote articles about politics and culture in the Prussian capital. And those are really interesting for us because one of them appeared in October 1882. So really just a few months after these pictures first arrived in Berlin. And he really talks about the sensation caused by the works and some of his own response, which is a mixture of criticism and admiration. He surmised, though, that the collection would, quote, provide a useful element of fermentation, end quote, for German painters. And a short quote from this text, he wrote, artistically, the distance between Paris and Berlin is such that not 1 out of 40 painters here has seen an Impressionist painting before. The first reaction was one of astonishment, almost consternation, even on the part of the youngest and most impressionable artists. Some did not know whether to take this seriously. One naively asked the owner whether he had really paid for this mess of paint. That was actually Adolf von Menzel in an oft-repeated anecdote. However, actually he used the word Dreck, but okay. However, even those who at the beginning had been among the most amazed and dismayed came back after several days and asked to see the pictures once more. The impression had not left them with a moment's peace, and they will, I think, in the end, include some new ideas in their own works. So I just now, and we're talking about mobility, show you some of these works, because they're a little hard to see in the black and white photograph. This is Manet's Departure of the Folkestone Ferry, which I should just actually say before we go through all of this that one of the other things that is really interesting to look at is to see where Felicie decided these works should go after her death. And she had an unusual, really I would say a privilege, and for German Jewish collectors it really was a privilege. She died in 1908, which means that she was still able to determine what happened to her collection. It wasn't confiscated, it wasn't subject to forced sale. And rather than bequeath the collection in its entirety to a museum, she carefully considered the most appropriate destination for each of the works of art, bequeathing them to public collections, but mainly to friends and members of her circle, along with the most other things she owned, like furniture, silver, etc. How much more?
Actually, not much more.
Okay, all right. Okay, so I'll do a quick thing. This painting was given to, bequeathed to Hugo von Schutte, whom we met. This is Manet's White Lilacs in a Vase, which is one of the few works she gave to a public collection. It went to the Nationalgalerie, but even in 1908, Impressionism was politically controversial and viewed as dangerous and even subversive by the emperor. And subsequently, this painting actually was sent to storage for many years before it was hung, but now you can see it today with the label that shows that it was donated by her. This went to Sabina Lepsius and her husband, Pizarro's Gouache, Sisley's, the Senate Argenteuil, went to Georg Treu, their very loyal friend, and here you can see the section from her will I marked in yellow where you see this painting, and Treu's in the Erinnerungen wrote about how important this was to him, this legacy, a particularly dear legacy. And now you can see, actually, this is the painting hanging this summer. It's been in private collections, but we borrowed it in Berlin for an exhibition this summer. Claude Monet's Field of Poppies, which I just bring because it was a picture that Max Liebermann really loved and tried to acquire after Carl died, and it was a little bit of a delicate situation. He wrote to a friend, she's a friend of mine, what do I do? He even included a sketch of the painting. And then you can see that she didn't want to sell it to him. She lent it to him, actually, and then bequeathed it to him in her will. And then finally, in her widowhood, she was very friendly with another salonière, Emma Dome. They traveled all over the world together, actually. These two women, here's one example. And she bequeathed her Monet, this particular one, and you can see it. Hanging here. So just to point out, in a way, the significance of these objects, that through her bequests, Felicie assured that the open spirit of her home would live on, as objects from the collection found their places in the homes of her friends. The art and furnishings in the Bernstein home did not serve merely as decoration or as objects of aesthetic pleasure. They were embodiments of their cosmopolitan worldview and values, intrinsic to the home they fashioned for themselves and for their friends. Thank you.